Hello, and welcome everyone to the launch of the Call It Out annual report for 2024-25. I'm Lindon Coombes and I'll be moderating today's event. I'm a Yuwalero man from Northwest New South Wales and I'm the Director of the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research here at the University of Technology, Sydney. Today's event is being live captioned. To view the captions, click on the CC button in your Zoom control panel. Any problems, let us know in the chat box. Before going any further, I'd like to begin by acknowledging country and the ongoing sovereignty and custodianship of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout this place and their enduring connections to community, lands and waters. I acknowledge the Gadigal people, where the Jumbunna Research UTS campus is, along with our partners, the National Justice Project. I'd also like to pay my respects to our elders and to all First Nations people and communities across the country that are joining us here today. This land is and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to specifically acknowledge and pay respects to the original and continuing owners of the various lands and waters where the team is dialing in from today. Gubbi Gubbi, Widjabul Wibble, Yirragunji, Gadigal, and wherever you may be coming from to us today. Just a content warning. Understand that these discussions can be sometimes difficult to hear, so please look after yourself. If you need to, take a break, speak to somebody you can trust, or contact one of the services that I believe Aisha is posting in the chat box. Housekeeping, a couple of quick housekeeping items before we continue. Today's event is being recorded. We'll email everyone a link to the webinar following the report following the event. We also have popped a link in the report, a link to the report in the chat. And depending how we go, I know we were a bit rushed last year with our Q&A at the end, but we want to leave some time to get to questions at the end. You can submit your questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A box, which is again in the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, let's get into it. I think we've got a hard stop at 2 o'clock, so we'll work towards that. Just to introduce today's speakers, Amelia Whyman. Amelia is a proud young Malangappa and Wonkamara woman. Among her many accomplishments, Amelia is a dancer and youth ambassador and Mountie Aboriginal Youth and with Mountie Aboriginal Youth and Community Services, where she speaks up as a young leader for her community and as a voice to empower future generations. We're incredibly fortunate to have Amelia with us here today and look forward to hearing from her shortly on issues impacting young people. But first, to speak to how and why Call It Out was created and the important issues arising in this year's report, we are joined by 3 members of the Jumbunna Call It Out team. Firstly, Associate Professor Fiona Allison. Fiona's work centres on working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to improve their civil and family law access to justice, including in the area of race discrimination and criminal justice outcomes through community-led justice reinvestment approaches. Welcome, Fiona. Professor Chris Caneen. Chris is a leading criminologist specialising in First Nations peoples and the law, juvenile justice, restorative justice, policing, prison issues and human rights. Welcome, Chris. And finally, Rebecca Lewis-Beck is a research fellow at Jumbunna and a Gomeroi Dunghutti Ngunnawal woman. She previously worked in the New South Wales Police Force and her current work embeds First Nations knowledges into operational practice education and systemic reform grounded in connection, cultural integrity, and truth-telling justice. Welcome back. So, yeah, looking forward to hearing from everyone. I'll hand over now to Professor Chris Cunneen. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Lindon. I'm just going to make a couple of introductory comments in relation to the report. So we want to acknowledge really first up that the stories that are shared on the register can be very difficult stories to tell. They have significant emotional and other impacts on those who are sharing them. And it is difficult to speak out about racism. So we acknowledge all of the individuals, the communities and organisations who've logged reports on Call It Out, that have helped to advocate Call It Out, and who continue to take steps to create change in their communities. While we've not been able to include all of the reports and experiences that were shared on the register, all of those have contributed to this report. All the incidents and reports that were logged on the register have been listened to, they've been read, they've been heard, irrespective of whether they are explicitly referenced in the report. I also want to say that the register, Call Out Register, is an independent Indigenous controlled reporting mechanism that is quite distinct from traditional complaints and legal processes. We start from the point that racism and discrimination can take many forms. It can be direct or indirect, interpersonal, online, or institutional. Unlike other mechanisms for reporting racism that are limited by distinct parameters, Call It Out is actually designed in a way to allow those people entering reports and incidents the freedom to share any experiences they consider relevant to understanding racism, and that enables us to develop a comprehensive representation of First Nations peoples' lived experiences of racism and discrimination. So this report's the third annual report of Call It Out, and it covers the period March 2024 to March 2025. It covers 442 verified reports, and often those reports cover multiple incidents and multiple victims. There are many similarities between the racism identified in this report and with previous years, like workplace racism, racism online, and social media. And there are also particularities in this reporting period. For example, the increased reports involving First Nations children and young people, and we'll return to that later. I also want to make a couple of comments about the limitations of Call It Out. If you just go to the next slide, Aisha, when you can. So it does rely largely on digital access and awareness. And so we have launched a phone app to improve accessibility, and we also allow people to make reports verbally over the phone. But it still does, to a large extent, rely on digital access, which may exclude some people. We also need to work towards translation of Call It Out into some of the key First Nations language, and to improve community awareness and engagement around Call It Out. And these are things that we're working on. Call It Out relies on self-reports and interpersonal racism. We're trying to improve the capture of systemic racism. However, systemic and institutional racism. However, any self-reporting mechanism or process like Call It Out tends to bias towards interpersonal racism. So access, awareness, self-reports mean that Call It Out is not an immediate capture of the extent of racism in the community. However, it is about building up an archive or a story over a number of years now that provides an important analysis of the nature of racism against First Nations people. And I think the other area we're working on to improve is intersectional discrimination. So the register focuses on racism towards First Nations people, but it doesn't capture well other intersecting forms of discrimination, such as those based on gender or disability. And that's something we need to work on improving. Next slide. So just a brief summary of who reported to the register. So non-Indigenous people made up about half of the reports, 51%, First Nations people 45%, and then a smaller group preferred not to say whether they were First Nations or non-Indigenous. Also, in terms of who reported the incidents, one of the things that's unique about Call It Out is that it does allow reports from third parties. So half of the reports, a bit over half of the reports, originated from witnesses of racism. A third of the reports, a bit over a third, were submitted by First Nations people who were directly impacted by racism. And we also allow friends or relatives to make reports. That's particularly important in relation to, for example, children, racism against children, where parents make reports. Now, I'm going to shift over now to Fiona, and Fiona's going to talk in a bit more detail about racism in the report.
Thank you, Chris. So we asked people, one of the questions we asked people is how they have experienced the racism they're reporting to the register. And as Chris just perhaps suggested, it's perhaps unsurprising, interpersonal racism was proportionally the most common experience identified, so 1 in every 3 responses. Systemic or institutional racism is less common but still relatively high, so 1 in every 5 responses. And then we have this crossover in the data, that 33%, which identifies both interpersonal and institutional racism as being experienced. This is partly because structural racism can be experienced interpersonally. So the example we've got here involves multiple instances of racism from staff working in a health service. This could be defined as institutional racism because you've got a number of individual racists targeting First Nations people as a pattern of behaviour, and the institution and perhaps the health system more broadly is clearly failing to address this racism. Each instance of racism, however, is likely to be felt personally by each First Nations employee, community member and First Nations patient interacting with these racist staff. Next slide, Aisha, please. We also asked people what type of racism they were reporting, and look, there's a lot of data in the report and a fair bit of data on the slides. We won't have time to unpack it all today, but just some key points about types of racism that we want to emphasise. Once again, as is always the case with our reporting, stereotyping and racist attitudes are the highest single category of type of racism. But when we combine types of racism that we're categorising as aggressive racism, and you can see what that constitutes there on the slides, this is actually proportionally the more common category of racism, and both of these are more likely than other types of racism to be identified as ongoing. So they're really significant issues overall. These and all other types of racism also are reported as occurring simultaneously. And we're going to provide some examples of how aggressive racism, stereotyping, and other types of racism occur within a single incident together. The next question we ask on the register is where the racism being reported occurred. So again, I'm not going to unpack all of this in a lot of detail. Beck's going to actually speak to the Justice Legal sitting location, and Chris will raise some issues around education, which was really prominent, or more prominent this year than previously. What I want to talk about is what I guess we might call public spaces. So that's combining public and commercial settings and public transport as the location of racism. And these equated to 1 in every 5 responses to the question. So it's fairly significant. We unpack the data a little bit more to try to fill out the story that we're trying to tell about racism, or the evidence we're trying to present. And in these spaces, aggressive racism is the most common type of racism occurring. You can see some of the statistics there. So nearly 1 half of all transport-related incidents. The other thing that was pronounced is that the most common locations for shunning and exclusion were also in public transport and commercial places. Thanks, Aisha. So just some of the reports that demonstrate this overlap in the data are here. So we've got the first account from an Aboriginal woman who reports feeling invisible when she's ignored or shunned in a store. She's just simply not served at all. And then the second one is about also from an Aboriginal woman feeling intimidated by tram inspectors that come at her fairly aggressively, assuming that she doesn't have a ticket, though she does. So this incident demonstrates how this second incident, how aggressive racism can be triggered by a false stereotype of First Nations peoples as lawbreakers. And this is really, really commonly reported to the register once again this year. There's also a number of other reports, similar reports in the register, including those describing assaults on children and young people and threats, intimidation in stores, that's also based on this same false stereotype. Thanks, Aisha. These same types of racism are perpetrated in these same public spaces by members of the public, and that's also really important to note. The first account here describes two Aboriginal women on a train platform. They're loaded up with shopping. The older woman, who has some health issues, is trying to find a seat to sit on, and she's shunned or excluded by another woman who blocks her from sitting, sharing her seat. The second account is from an Aboriginal woman who saw images inciting genocide on her bus during a bus trip, and presumably they were graffitied and left there by another passenger. And just as an additional point, social media and online incidents, as we just saw in the slide, in the data, they're the most commonly reported locations for racism, and 2/3 of these incidents identified aggressive racism in that space. So reports spoke about how what occurs online, which is really this mixed public and private space, feeds into hate and violence out in the real world and vice versa, and that includes in public spaces. So what we can see here is an online post with another reference to what the Aboriginal witness sharing it described as threatening genocide. And this last quote comes from an Aboriginal mother who's really concerned. She expresses concern about this type of aggressive content that she's seeing on her local social media pages. Though none of them are directly targeting her, what she expresses is that she's worried that it might lead to her or her children being physically harmed in local public places. And there are a number of reports raising similar concerns. Thanks, Aisha. Over to Beck.
Yeah, the Call It Out reports this year, particularly in the criminal justice and legal setting, we actually had a high volume of reports on police incidents, with relatively few reports in relation to prison and court systems. So the majority of the reports actually highlighted concerns in policing, especially in how police respond to victims of crime. A key issue is the lack of adequate police follow-up, the dismissive attitude towards First Nations people when they're actually reporting. Requests to review CCTV footage from the victims were persistently denied by police, so inadequate investigations, and often ignored as well. Victims also describe being stereotyped, feeling labelled as the Aboriginal problem, rather being supported as a victim of crime. And the slide actually shows you two examples of this that were reported to the Call It Out. Reports also included victims, for example, the two that are on the slide now, that was actually physically assaulted in public venues, racially charged violence, which followed by unsatisfactory police investigation. Also, the police assuming the fault against First Nations people when they're actually victims of crime. So yeah, that was the big one, particularly not giving that victim care and support that's required for First Nations people. Next slide, Asha. Also, this was a single report to the Call It Out, and I just thought to share this as I suppose, a pretty powerful example of the multi-layers of racism that can present from a single incident within the criminal justice system. It highlights not only interpersonal racism through police direct abuse, threats, dismissive attitudes, but also institutional racism, reflected in the neglect of duty of care, ignoring custody protocols, and misuse of police power. The woman experience here through the self-report, Aboriginal woman's experience, shows just by being a witness calling out racism, she actually filmed police and a security officer, their mistreatment and the use of excessive force on a 9-year-old child at a shopping centre. This then led to a chain of harmful actions towards her. She was actually arrested by police using excessive force of arrest. And then whilst in police custody, she actually suffers from a complex PTSD. She readily asks for help in support of medical support, which was denied to her. She asked for an Aboriginal community liaison officer, which was denied to her. The ridicule of trauma, dehumanising police responses, invasive searches in custody. Also the joke that they also highlighted in custody that she actually may die, and they joked about it. The story shows how the convergence of interpersonal aggression, systemic failures, and the perpetrator of discrimination escalating into harm, denying of basic dignity and rights, and safety to those who are most risk and vulnerable in police custody. The woman also complained to the police organisation about all these actions, and nothing was obviously followed up. All these police, no action was taken about their actions. Next one, Usha. Also, reports continue in relation to the persistent systemic racism and the psychological harm stemming from the repeated police targeting, both of young people and adults, and these young people will be spoken to later. These patterns of over-policing, perpetrating distress and reinforcing mistrust in First Nation communities. The example showing on the slide, in particular, one incident involved police pursuing a woman, mistakenly believing she was a husband due to a minor driving license issue, subsequently questioning her about him. Furthermore, the same family then had 5 police officers attend their family home to question their son regarding a minor cannabis matter, which warrants a caution anyway under the law. A response widely viewed as excessive and provoking. The family it caused significant stress to this family in relation to that response. Also, as highlighted by a non-Indigenous witness, reported police extinguishing a sacred ceremonial fire, confiscating cultural tools at Camp Sovereignty in the King's Domain. While the tools were reportedly handed back, the incident highlights a broader pattern of misunderstanding, racist bias towards Aboriginal culture and sacred practices. The sacred fire in particular represents a powerful symbol of resistance, sovereignty, and treaty movement. It's also important to acknowledge here as well that the violent incidents that occurred at Camp Sovereignty this year, where police reportedly failed to intervene to actually protect the safety and victims on that day who were assaulted and violence occurred. Next slide, Usha. Ongoing reports also highlighted persistent issues ranging from excessive policing to surveillance to a lack of cultural respect. How systemic structures continue to perpetrate racism. This leads to enduring trauma, diminished cultural safety, and growing mistrust in authorities. Notably this year, findings reveal that young people are particularly susceptible to racial profiling and monitoring. These practices extend beyond individual harm, influencing how entire generations perceive law enforcement and justice systems. Rather than feeling protected, young people often experience criminalisation and public humiliation, as demonstrated in this year's report. Incidents such as the public vilification of youth, where actually media coverage and police actions were on display in media for imagery, which obviously reflects the historical also abuses of images of our people, including young children handcuffed on the ground during police operations, exemplifying the adverse impact these responses have on community trust and wellbeing. Next one, Marsha. We also had concerns in the reports about laws, in particular the public drinking restrictions and move-on powers, and how police exercise their discretion in decision-making and enforcing these in the Northern Territory. They're not only intentionally discriminative, but directly contribute to the racial profiling and criminalisation of First Nations people. People were concerned about these legal frameworks do not operate in isolation. They systemically target and marginalise individuals, perpetrating cycles of disadvantage and inclusion. Also, reports were also concerned about the Victoria Bail Act, which have raised concerns as well. These changes see foreseeable disproportionary effect First Nations people, resulting into increased rates of incarcerations while awaiting trial. Concerns raised with legislative trends also towards expanding police powers reflects a broader shift. Social challenges are increasingly met with punitive law and order responses rather than holistic community First Nation-centred solutions. The effect is to push First Nations people further out of public spaces and into the margins rather than fostering inclusion and safety. These stories are not isolated incidents, but are informative of deeper systemic discrimination embedded within our laws and practices. The report shows that law themselves can reinforce racial intent. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. And I'm going to just jump in now and run through a few more slides, and then we're going to have focus on children and young people in the report. So we asked people how they felt after incidents that we've just been discussing occurred. And generally what we found, again, there's a lot of data on the slide and in the report that I won't unpack in a lot of detail, but just some key themes. Generally, we heard that there were multiple emotional responses arising at the same time after people experienced racism. These emotional impacts can be long-term, cumulative, and felt across generations. So we did hear from parents and other relatives, for example, who described feeling pain and despair and distress when witnessing racism targeting younger family members, or when talking about this targeting as a sad inevitability. The first quote here is speaking to these cumulative impacts, and this just returns us back to the story of the two women on the train platform. And how they experienced that cumulative impact at that time. Other impacts of racism that aren't on the slide there in terms of emotional responses but are connected to them include loss of employment causing financial hardship and of relationships and connection. So the quotes here are about these types of impacts. The first one is about workplace racism incident and how it impacted, and the second about racism experienced by a First Nations woman at the hands of her non-Indigenous sister. And both of these show racism occurring and or having impacts in private settings. I think that's important to note alongside what we've just been discussing in terms of public settings. Thanks, Aisha. We asked people what they did about the incidents that they were reporting. Again, there's a bit of data up there, but just some of the key themes. We heard that calling out racism again. We heard this is really, really important. That's been consistent across LA reports, either to defend oneself or someone else, or to bring about change more generally, which is what that first quote speaks to. And look, we did see once again many examples of people calling racism out, and importantly, in whatever way felt possible and comfortable and realistic in the circumstances. So this second quote here is again about those two women on the train platform, and what they did in that case was just call out and name the racism within earshot of the woman in question. You can see here in the data, talking to family and friends is once again a really important response or a preferred response, a common response to racism. So for the First Nations man that's quoted here, he experienced racism from friends of his non-Indigenous in-laws who were making jokes in his presence about culling Aboriginal people. His in-laws were laughing. At the time, he removed himself because he was pretty angry and he didn't want to retaliate. And you can see the proportion of people reporting a retaliation there is pretty low. Then he went back and confronted them the next day and asked them to leave his home. And he identified talking to his father after this as a really positive response, and he provided validation and support. Thanks, Aisha. Next slide. We did hear a lot again, because we asked questions about it, about the huge barriers to challenging racism, including that there's really very little trust that doing so is going to lead to any type of accountability for perpetrators or other useful responses, as well as significant concerns about repercussions. So this first quote here is from an Aboriginal woman who reported racism in sport. She was called a half-caste and missed out on a position she was looking to take up. And she also has children playing in that same sporting area. She spoke really clearly of the difficulties of speaking the truth about what had happened for fear of repercussions for all of them. And she reported to the register as a safe space, but as you can see here, she still had concerns for her safety. As we saw in the earlier data about responses, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the barriers, 1 in 4 people reported disengaging, avoiding the place or person associated with racism and or not doing or saying anything about the incident. The First Nation woman reporting that tram incident we spoke about earlier said that she'd never been on a tram since, for example, and another Aboriginal person identified racism as a silencer along these same lines. Sometimes responses like this are protective mechanisms because calling out racism is just so challenging and perhaps dangerous. One Aboriginal woman was told to move over, you black cunt, excuse the language, but that's what's in the report and what was reported. And she did nothing in response because she said she was afraid of being stabbed. And at other times, not doing anything can feel uncomfortable and perhaps a bit like another form of shunning and exclusion. Next slide, please. So what needs to be done to combat racism, which is really, really important, and where we want to partly get to with this platform, is trying to find some solutions. Firstly, it's important to note that in combination, First Nations sovereignty, amplifying First Nations voices and prioritising First Nations-led responses made up 1 in 3 responses to this question. And community-embedded responses are evident in the preference we just saw for talking to First Nations friends and family. And in calls, we heard about for strong Indigenous leadership and leading into culture in the face of racism. We again heard, as per this second quote here, that really all of the above is needed. So it's not a single strategy. As an example, key strategies identified included supporting people to call racism out, make complaints, and educating the public to change attitudes. And clearly, Australia has a really big problem with racist attitudes that need to be addressed. But alongside that, it can't be the end of the story. There was a really strong push for increased legal and other accountability. So this quote here is from an Aboriginal woman who'd experienced racism in the workplace, who said it wasn't just up to her to call it out, given what it costs her, and that you need proper mechanisms for that'll hold racists to account. And that's all I have. I'm going to pass across to you, Chris, now.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. One of the things that really came out this year, which was different from previous years, was the age of victims, that is, children and young people being subjected to racism. And so over a quarter of all of the reports that were able to identify the age of the victim identified children and young people. And by that we define people 19 years old or younger. So this was a really significant finding this year and different from previous years. Also related to that was that children and young people were actually proportionately more likely to experience bullying, threats or intimidation, physical harm than other age groups. And so they were more likely to be subjected to aggressive racism. Next slide, Aisha. And again, what was interesting in terms of the results in relation to the location of racism targeting children and young people was the issue around school and educational settings. Now, the most common areas of location were media, social media and online by 31%, but 30% of the location that was identified was schools and educational settings. And again, this I think is an area that's really significant and perhaps neglected in terms of the analysis of racism and its targeting of young people. Next slide, Aisha. So education-related incidents described multiple incidents in a school setting, specifically in a school setting. So children and young people were proportionally more likely to be targeted by perpetrators in their own age group rather than other victims. So it's children of similar ages bullying, racist bullying, First Nations kids. And there's some quotes there on the side which give some examples. And also the reports to the register showed the failure of schools to respond effectively to racist behaviour, with repeated complaints going unaddressed. And so there were a number of, obviously the mother or the father of the child made the report on the register and identified the fact that they had made complaints in the school, but they weren't addressed. Okay. Other incidents actually was not just the failure of responses by the school, but individual staff perpetrating racism against students. And again, I won't read them out. There's a couple there which give you some examples of that, but there's certainly more than those in the report. Okay, next slide. One of the things that I think is really important that came up is the longer term effects on education, the longer term effects of racism on the education of children and young people. So the example on the left was, my child loves school, and the lack of appropriate responses from the school has created the situation now where the child no longer wants to go to school because it's seen to be an unsafe place for an Aboriginal person. And the one on the right, it forced me to drop out of school. And to this day, I still haven't completed my schooling, and I have a fear of teachers and people who were supposed to help me and support me. So those long-term effects, I think, are really important to acknowledge in relation to racism against children. Okay, next slide, please. And I've just got one longer quote here, which I won't read it out, but this is still a young woman, but out of school age, who's reflecting back on her experiences of school. And as it says in the heading there, I was so miserable, I wanted to kill myself. That it's the darkest parts of her life, and it's something that will always that she'll always be scarred by. And at the bottom of the quote, never in my life have I felt more disgraceful and unwelcomed as an Indigenous person on my own country. So the issues around schooling, I think, are really important and really an area that needs to be addressed, because to the extent that it is addressed in school situations, it tends to be addressed as bullying, not as racism. And so having an anti-bullying strategy in a school doesn't address racism and aggressive racism against First Nations children. The racist verbal abuse and hate speech that targeted children was also identified as outside of schools. And just one slide here, giving some examples. I mean, the examples in the report are located in public, they're located in sport, residential care, and the police, as Beck has previously noted, were all seen as racially abusing or targeting First Nations children. But the one on the left was a 3-year-old girl, and it's not the first time in Call It Out where we've had examples of children as young as 2 or 3 being racially abused. And I think this one, for anyone who has a child, you can imagine this girl, 3-year-old girl, going out in her Princess Elsa dress and feeling pretty good about herself wearing that dress, and then to be told by a woman that she was black and that black is ugly and that she could never be Elsa. The effect of that on that child. The other example there is one from sport, where, again, there are a number of reports around racist taunts and racial abuse against Aboriginal kids on the sporting field or by, in this case, by their fellow teammates, where he was called a monkey and then also abused in his home. And I think that's probably all, yes, for me.
Thanks for that, Chris. I think we have Amelia who's joined us now. Amelia, I did give you a bio earlier before, so I'll hand over to you now. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Amelia Whyman. I'm 17. I'm a proud Mullingup and Wonkamara woman. I grew up in a small town called Wilkenya. It's in the far western of New South Wales. I danced with the Barkinji Barker dance group, which was created by my father and a dream. I speak up as a young leader for my community and surrounds, as a voice to empower the next generation. I then moved to Sydney to build connections and get my voice to be more known. I started doing dance with a well-known dance group called the Budja Budja Butterfly Dancers, created and still going strong by Rayma Johnson. I'm also working as a youth ambassador with Mountie Aboriginal Youth and Community Services, building an Aboriginal youth peak for New South Wales, so young people can have more of a voice in decisions that affect their lives and have a place to be themselves. Racism affects young people as it can affect the mindset of young people and how they see the world. A kid can grow up in a happy family and then they experience racism and they get confused about their place in the world and they can't get a sense of community from that. They feel isolated. Everyone has been told about it, but it affects everyone differently when you experience it firsthand. It can make some people get depressed or separate themselves from society. It can lead people to feeling like suicide. It can affect their mental state and their physical state. It can stop them from eating and drinking, which will cause them to get too skinny and get sick. It can bring back all the trauma from generations because stories get passed down from their elders, and especially the racist incidents, and you can experience pain that is passed down from your ancestors. You can get scared for your cultural safety, your physical safety, like you feel it deep within your soul. Um, my answers connect to me spiritually. There have been like so many things over the years that we as First Nations people weren't allowed to do through the stolen generations and other racist policies. We couldn't stand up back then, but now we can. We can have a voice now. Sometimes my ancestors would say this isn't a safe space for you. They would speak to me. Other times they're saying you should stand your ground, so that telling me to have confidence and to be able to talk back. Um, a fair few adults and young people want to take action against racism, but some would be scared or clueless about how to do it because they wouldn't know the programs that can help them. Some people walk away and some people will stand up because they won't let anyone talk about their culture. Others will go to through the legal route. A lot of people don't know the ways about it to go legally, sorry, and how they can get help and handle the situations. And the situations can come through culture from First Nations peoples themselves, but also everyone does have a role in addressing racism and recognizing and responding to it. Everyone needs to understand that of racism and its effect on people's mindsets and mental health. Sometimes at schools they do Koori lunch meetings. There's cultural dancing too, but there's really nothing else for the First Nations students. And after these activities, they go back into a school community where they don't feel culturally safe. In communities, we exchange a lot of cultural stories. We learn how to use clapsticks, didgeridoo, we learn how to make bundis and spears, which also gets passed down by our ancestors. We have consistent workshops, and whole days in school around, we should have consistent workshops and whole days in schools around cultural activities like making clapsticks and learning language and how to do yarning circles and weaving. Um, and I just think it would be better for the young kids to be able to connect with their community to help them feel more culturally connected in a school setting where around a place where they don't feel familiar or culturally safe. And I think it'd be very much needed for the young First Nations people to be able to have an opinion on this. Because a lot of kids don't actually have a voice. I'm a young leader from back home, and um here I'm also doing this. I help other kids my age. And I think a lot of young people need to stop being shut down. Young people can get a lot of valuable insights and they can help each other, help other people understand how young Aboriginal people work and how their mindsets work. Our voice is very valuable and I definitely think it is very much needed. Um, I think there are also many solutions that in coming together to help young Aboriginal kids. Since I went to Sydney to go to school in 2022, and I became independent, I've become more confident and I had to stand up for myself more, because I didn't have a lot of support. I was unfamiliar, I didn't know the people. And with some people, some young people from Mount Druitt, I'm helping with creating an Aboriginal youth peak for New South Wales. And in that space, I can just be me, I can be comfortable, I can speak up. And it's useful to come together with other young Aboriginal people in a place that I didn't feel comfortable in. And there are plenty of supports out there, but people don't know about them. I've experienced racism, but I don't want my future kids and their kids to experience it growing up because it's not a nice thing. We need accountability and more education at schools. At one school, my one student was suspended after a racist incident against the First Nations student who was affected emotionally, who didn't feel safe. Part of me think that's good. They then understand that racism isn't the right thing. But sending them back to their family, they're probably not going to be pulled up at home. They're just going to go about their normal day. While they're suspended, I think they should be required to learn about cultural and spiritual connections, how racism impacts First Nations people, to write an essay about the things about why racism shouldn't exist, why it's bad. Then they can think about how to apologize to the First Nations young person, and wait until the First Nations people are like safe enough or feel comfortable enough to be able to hear that. Um, I think the schools need to play a role in that as well, but I think it would be more helpful to have a community member come in and help navigate that kind of situation. Police can be corrupt and racist too. Just because they're a part of the law doesn't mean they're not racist. Someone can be arrested but not know their rights. Police can hurt that person physically and treat them badly because the person who's being arrested doesn't know any requirements that they should have their legal rights as a person against the police officer. And it gives them a bad experience because that person doesn't understand the law and they wouldn't know what actions to take to stop the corrupt crop. There's a lot of races in the justice system. Not everyone has taken action on it. We need a support system for those treated badly by police, where they can learn what their rights are and how to uphold them. Maybe a community support program where young people can access legal information and advice before they're likely to get targeted by police. Things that they can do to support themselves, how to speak so they won't be clueless and all alone when they're in the justice system.
Thank you, Amelia. That was amazing, very informative and powerful. And I can see by all the heart and clappy and thumbs up emojis that everyone feels similarly. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you to all the speakers for getting across a lot of information very quickly. So that leaves us with about 10 minutes for some questions. And I believe the first question we have is from Beck.
Amelia, thanks for coming and sharing. That was amazing. Absolutely love that and your experiences. My first question to you, Amelia, would be, sorry, I'm losing my voice. You've achieved so much, for someone so young. In the introduction, you talked about your experience of racism, the important work you do in community as a youth ambassador, and the importance of staying connected to family, country, and culture. Can I ask, where do you get your strengths from, particularly when you speak about calling out racism?
A lot of my strength gets pulled back from my ancestors. Because of the stories that got passed down, I also feel the pain that they once experienced. I'm also taught a lot from my dad. My dad's very strong-minded when it comes to being Aboriginal. We used to do a lot of the marches across the bridge to have our voice heard. When I was 11, I designed the logo for the Indigenous Party of Australia. And we put together the party because of the issues of racism and being ignored. So we decided to have a voice in Parliament. And I learnt that my strength from my dad because he taught me the rights and wrongs, same as his father did to him, and same as his nan. They taught me what's respectful and what's not. And as you get older, you keep learning. I had a lot of messages around being staunch growing up. Um, I still get those messages sometimes. I cried when I got accepted into school in Sydney because I didn't want to leave my home. I was very connected to my culture. I didn't want to leave my community and I didn't want to make new friends. I was happy with the friends I had. Um, and my dad and my brother brought me to Sydney in 2022 in February, and they both told me, keep your head up, keep your head down, focus and don't look back, and you can make a lot of changes for a lot of the kids back in Kenya that they don't have the chance to do, and they can look up to me and get inspiration from me. But I did struggle a lot with the cultural shock of it. When I got to Sydney, when I got to the school, most of the time, I was really culturally connected back home, but um, going into this new place where there was a lot less cultural business around me, it shocked me a lot, and I wasn't used to it. Then I started doing some cultural dancing, which was with Rayma Johnson with the Budja Budja Butterfly Dance. answers, and that helped me a lot. It helped me gain back my sense of community after those 3 years without it. And then that's why I think we should be doing more like that schools to help young Aboriginal people with culture shock, to stay connected and not be overwhelmed by not being around community and culture anymore, because it does hit them hard. And when I graduated from school, my uncle, Badger Bates, he does a lot of artworks as a voice for Aboriginal people, and he inspires me a lot also. But he said to me, "We're proud of you and you have to keep going." So when I graduated, they all congratulated me, but my father had a talk with me. He said, "You've made us proud. You can't come back home. You have to stay down there and make a change." And it sort of stuck in my head since then. It won't leave. It's a bit annoying, but I like it. But I do want to make a change. In a workspace or school area or in any social interactions. I want for people to look at another person and just think they're another ordinary person. They're not of this background, not of that background. We're all just equally the same. And they don't feel the need to say anything about their cultural background, and that person doesn't offend each other, where they just see each other as equals.
Thanks, Amelia. I see we've got one question in the Q&A box from Shirley Hines. Maybe it's for Chris and Fiona. What is the follow-up to the report and how can non-Indigenous supporters help?
Sorry? Was that you?
That was probably for Chris and Fiona.
Oh, well, we can both have a go at this, Fiona, if you like. But look, I mean, there's a lot that can be done. I mean, obviously, working at a community level is really important in terms of racism at a local level. I think it's also important to really, one of the things that we've been up against is really spreading knowledge about Call It Out as a register where people can record racism. And I think, as we've said, it's not just up to Aboriginal people, First Nations people to be recording racism on the register. It's also for everyone else who witnesses racism in the community. So I think they're kind of basic things, but what needs to be done.
Fiona? No, nothing further to add. I think that maybe another question there, I think from Miriam. She says, isn't the first priority to ensure the safety of all First Nations people wherever they are by increasing legal anti-racism pushback? I guess this is something that comes up in all of our anti-racism work, is what are the consequences for people who perpetrate these racist incidents. We did a report on Collingwood Football Club some years ago, and that was one of the things that the Indigenous person was left to deal with, the pain and hurt, and the perpetrator went on to do personal development. So might open that up to the panel about consequences of racism.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just thinking about the civil law consequences is there's a whole lot of issues that we've had raised in the report and that we're aware of to make it really difficult for people to access them. And are they even sufficient when you do try to access the remedies that are under civil law? We have had people reporting into us to say there needs to be more criminalisation or, penalties, criminal penalties attached to racism. It's definitely a really important point. The lack of accountability comes through really clearly every year. So yeah, it's an important point. But I guess this year we saw that people weren't necessarily, if you look at the data, they were interested in supporting people to make complaints and to use those legal mechanisms, but it was also just about having really strong legal mechanisms in place so that behaviours could change almost in the shadow of the law, and people might change their behaviours because they know if they don't, there are penalties out there that might be applied.
And I think too, if I could just add quickly to that, those systems of accountability need to be at a local level as well. It needs to be at the local school It needs to be within the university. It needs to be within the workplace. So yeah, there's a kind of broader legal framework, but there's also systems of accountability at a much more local institutional level that really need to be addressed. And I think that's obviously, something we can all do in terms of addressing racism.
We also heard that there's spaces where there's not a lot of clarity around the law. So social media was one of those, and people will just pile on and put a whole lot of horrible, disgusting content in there. And that's because they feel they can get away with it. The platforms aren't doing much about it, but it does feel like people don't actually know what their responsibilities are on there, both as platform holders, but also the people that are sharing the content. So that's another thing, clarifying the law.
Thanks, Chris and Fiona. That's taken us up to 1:58. I'd like to thank all of the panellists, in particular our very special guest, Amelia Whyman. Just amazing to hear from you. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for being a strong young leader that you are, and we'll all be looking forward to see how you grow and lead into the future. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aisha, for doing all the stuff behind the scenes to make it work. And am I handing over to anyone?
Beck, I think.
Beck.
Yep. You're on mute.
Beck.
Yeah.
I just want to thank everyone for sharing their stories, to call it out, and keep telling truth, justice. And as we were just saying, I said, actually, it's just a personal story. I said to Fiona and Chris before I was part of the Call It Out, when I was working in the police, I wish I knew about the register, because I definitely would have called it out a lot more. So those staff also in those institutions, please call it out, because that's where we find accountability, through calling it out. And then it helps with evidence-based, that we have this evidence now of truth-telling stories, which can hopefully change and reform systems in the institutions that harm First Nations people as well. Thanks to all our supporters, and to everyone involved in Call It Out. Very much appreciated. And anything else that Fiona and Christopher want to add as well?
And that's fine. Thanks, Beck.
Can we also just thank Dr. Kirsten Gray for her artwork for the report cover. You can find out more about her stuff. I popped the links in the chat, and she did all that while she was pregnant and having a baby. So we are extra grateful. And yeah, I popped some extra links in the chat for contacting us. You can, if you don't have access to the Call It Out app or the website, you can give us a call and we can call you back and take your report. We have postcards and other resources if your organisation would like some to put around schools or workplace. Give us a shout. Thank you.
Last thing from me, there are just some questions on the slides. Are we able to share those?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll do our best to get those out. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again to the panellists. Thank you, Aisha. Thanks, everyone, for giving up your time today, for the comments and the links in the chat. And thank you all. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.